Hello once again. I'm back. Obviously, I retired to the basement from the previous installment of this where we talked about the Great Famine and demographics because the weather's looking very threatening outside. And so we will be back in the basement for the rest of this lecture where we're going to take up the Black Death. And as you notice, I put on some headgear. Weird thing, actually. I got this at a Steve Earle concert at the National down in Richmond. God, it's been years ago. I don't remember how long now. Sometime in the last 7 or 8 years. And it seems sort of appropriate, if a little gloomy. Although with the hammer and sickle, he doesn't just look like the Grim Reaper. It looks like a Marxist skeleton. But anyway, it is what it is. I use it to scare the trick-or-treaters actually at Halloween because I feel if you're going to go beg at my door, and I am going to give you lots of nice chocolatey candy, you have to suffer that little bit of fear. And so it's very effective on younger children. But that being said, uh, I'm going to try to, in as upbeat a way as possible, give you the lowdown on what is a very gloomy topic, and a topic that has some currency for us now because obviously, as everyone knows, as you're experiencing, we are dealing with a pandemic, a very modern sort of influenza type pandemic. The major pandemic that was dealt with in the Middle Ages was this thing called the Black Death. And we should never lose the connection to our preceding topic. We were talking about the Great Famine within a particular context, how this man named Michael Poston had posited this idea of a Malthusian crisis. And there's been a lot of pushback and revision of that idea, but the idea is still sort of out there. It's still a subject of some discussion and debate. But the point is, even if a Malthusian crisis existed, even if it was clear that population was outrunning resources, that Europe just ceased to have the ability to feed itself on the basis of its available land and agricultural technology, even if that were the case, and we don't know in any absolute sense whether it was or whether it wasn't, there was a solution to the entire problem that arrived from the outside. If Europe had been overpopulated prior to the Black Death, it certainly was not after it occurred. You consider problem solved to the degree that you consider this a solution to a problem. But before we get into this pandemic itself, and it was a pandemic, it wasn't just in Europe, it was also in Asia. Actually, during this period, we should say a little bit about epidemic disease during the High Medieval period, the period preceding the appearance of the Black Death. There were epidemics in the Middle Ages, but in the High Middle Ages, but none of them were general. You don't have anything that's really continent-wide, but you do have epidemics. There were some epidemics that followed actually the Great Famine, as we already mentioned. You had a lot of dysentery, which isn't necessarily an epidemic disease. You had some typhus in the area at the end of it. And if you look at the Middle Ages, typhoid, leprosy, uh, pneumonia, pleurisy, influenza, there were these and lots of other ailments that people could get in sort of an epidemic way. There was also another ailment that's a peculiarly medieval sort of thing, this thing called ergotism, where people would eat badly spoiled rye or types of grain, particularly rye, and they would die happy because they would have these sort of psychedelic hallucinations as they were going down, seeing dragons and crap like that. You had various types of epidemic disease in the high medieval period, but none of it was generalized. It was not something that affected the entire continent in any sort of comprehensive way. And there was no smallpox, as far as we know, during the Middle Ages. Smallpox was this very fearsome, really early modern disease, um, for which it's been eradicated. It exists in laboratory conditions, but actually I was still part of that generation. Whereas you were a very young child, you were given the smallpox shot as it existed back then, which wasn't really a shot. It was this odd little peculiar thing they would prick you with, and I still have a smallpox scar from the vaccination for smallpox because it was a very fearsome disease as well. It wasn't clear that people suffered from that one during the Middle Ages. That was a more recent development. But what is clear is that in the middle of the 14th century in Europe, a plague appears. And the Black Death was the most widespread and most devastating epidemic ever to strike England and also Europe generally. There was never anything that was worse than this when you consider the level of mortality and the time period over which that mortality was inflicted. It was relatively quick and it was devastating. No question about that. It's a watershed event between the High and Late Middle Ages. It's one of those things that leads to fundamental change in European society. I don't think anybody can question that. Obviously, there were changes going on prior to this, and certainly the Great Famine had its consequences, but they were magnified during the Black Death. And for the people living through it, it was an exceedingly jarring event. For those of you who have taken a look at that editorial that I wrote for the local paper here about the Black Death coronavirus comparison, I'm going to repeat a couple of things I said in that there was this Irish chronicler, a man named John Clun of Kilkenny, who was born sometime around 1300 and obviously dies in 1349, which meant that he probably expired from the plague ultimately himself. And he's writing sort of a narrative, and at the very end of it, in his codex, he leaves blank leaves. And at the very end of the chronicle, he says, in case anyone should be alive in the future. Clearly, as he's viewing this, and apparently he himself succumbs to it, he is of the opinion that this is just going to kill everybody. And that's how severe the mortality was. That's the way, this sort of apocalyptic way, in which people tend to process it at the time. And in areas where population had not already begun to decline prior to this, they did. This was it was very general in its impact. In terms of where the disease, this pandemic began, it begins in Asia somewhere. People say China frequently. And there was a suggestion that it was endemic in the animal population there, and that for whatever reason, it begins to move westward from the 1330s onward and gradually makes its way toward Europe. It crosses Asia in the 1340s. And in terms of how it gets into Europe proper, and particularly Western Europe, there's sort of a traditional story that's told about it, where the plague comes to the Crimea region. That should be a little bit familiar to you because it was that area in dispute between Ukraine and Russia effectively seized it back in 2014 and made it part of Russia again. So it's an area that it's been in the news for different reasons. But the point here, and I'm just going to give you this traditional story. You have a Genoese trading post, the Genoese from Italy. They have a trading post at Kaffa, a city on the Black Sea in the Crimea region. And in 1347, the city is besieged by the Tartars or Tatars, either name is applied to them. Actually, most people prefer Tatar rather than Tartar because of its connections with Tartarus, so it can be viewed in sort of a negative way, but either works. The city was being besieged by the Kipchak Khan Yanabeg, and as the city was being besieged, the Genoese and the others inside the city noticed something. They were looking out from the walls, and they saw that there seemed to be some sort of mortality occurring among the Tartars, that they were dying, and it wasn't quite clear why. And as the story goes, the Tartars took some of their corpses, some of the dead, in variants of the story. In one variant, they decapitate some of the bodies, and they catapult the heads into the city. One account, I think, suggests that the entire bodies were catapulted in, which is a little tougher to credit, actually. But the point is that there was this sense that because they had done this, whatever had been affecting them had been catapulted into the city to affect the Genoese and the other populations there. And some people cite this as a very early example of effective germ warfare, where you're using a disease against one's enemy. The Genoese, after the siege had broken because the Tartars couldn't maintain it with all this mortality, they jump into their galleys, and the story is that they transport the plague along with them, particularly within the spices that they were carrying, as the accounts go. And the plague struck wherever these Genoese galleys landed. It is clear that there's plague in Sicily, in Calabria in southern Italy, in the town of Marseille in southern France, and in Genoa in northern Italy by late 1347. And so this is one of the stories that you get told traditionally in the chronicles about how this plague that had affected Asia makes its way into Europe proper. Once people realized this was a problem, there were efforts recorded in the chronicles by people to drive ships away from ports as the plague progressed, because there was some awareness that the ships may be bearing a very special gift with them. And this is kind of current because, of course, we had this issue where initially there was this large cruise ship docked on the West Coast, and Mr. Trump was initially reluctant to let the people disembark from the boat onto to the country, because those who had been affected with the coronavirus, for however many of them there were at that point, would be added to the small number who had been already infected on the land by that point. And the claim was Mr. Trump didn't want to inflate his figures. Actually, given the number of people that have it, and as of this morning, the last number I saw was 530,000 confirmed cases in the country, it wouldn't have made much difference. But that's how he was thinking at that juncture. But this notion of this awareness that it could be spread by ships coming into your port became a fairly general thing, and people would try to drive ships away to prevent it from coming into their port cities. The larger point here is that nothing that they did was very effective in terms of halting its advance, that it spreads rapidly in Europe. To give you sort of a chronology of it, well, it's kind of a geographical chronology, and if you're thinking about a map of Europe, visualize it in your head. If we were in class, I would be showing you a transparency map, but you can sort this out for yourself easily enough without a map, that it moves largely in a clockwise fashion, starting in Italy by late, say, December of 1347. It's in France during 1348 and 1349. It's in England and Germany in 1349 and 1350. It's in Scandinavia and Northern Europe 1350-51. And then it continues to move eastward at that point and dies along the northern fringes of Europe and Russia late in 1351. And so it's something that affects the entirety, basically, of continental Europe, with few exceptions, over the course of about a 4-year period. Actually, more like a 3-year period when you really think about it. It's a fairly rapidly spreading thing. And a few areas were spared. In the old days, people would talk about pockets basically in the Low Countries and in modern day, in what was then Bohemia, modern day, basically Czech Republic, where they didn't seem to have it. But in recent years, people have begun even to dispute that these areas did in fact have it. Maybe it wasn't reported as much, but it was certainly there on some level. So even that's been revised. Actually, if I'd shown you one of my old maps, there'd be these little patches in pink where people thought it hadn't occurred. And now people are beginning to basically erode that notion as well. It was actually fairly general. So anyway, few areas were spared. And what ultimately made it more frightening, it's frightening enough just on the basis of what it is, that people began to know that it was coming, basically. Only the Italians were really taken by surprise for this one in terms of these initial appearances. Once it gets moving on the continent, people hear reports, people are fleeing in front of it. The news spreads that there is this horrible disease, and it's probably eventually going to reach you because it's continuing to move. And so it was designed, well, design's probably the wrong word, but it was something that was bound to really magnify terror as people dealt with it. So let's talk about what the disease was, and then we can get into the notion of its consequences and how people responded to it. So we'll talk first about epidemiology and pathology, and deal with it from a somewhat medical perspective, although I'm not a medical person. Obviously, my interest in it are more social and economic and cultural in terms of its consequences. And as we move into this topic, over the last 20 years, it's been a subject of some controversy about what the disease actually is. Though the controversy has mostly subsided now, and there seems to be an increasing certainty about what the identity of the disease was that caused this. In the traditional, so first I'm going to give you the traditional story, and then I'm going to give you the alternative stories, the alternative explanations that have cropped up very briefly. The traditional story is that it's caused by a bacillus. The initial name of it was called Pasteurella pestis. The more modern name that's been assigned to it is Yersinia pestis. And they were both named, obviously, the Pasteurs you know about, or I would hope so. Daniel Yersin was a more modern person who was involved, although not that modern, in the identification of the bacillus. And so the more modern name, it's named after him. In terms of what it is, it's a bacillus that is in the stomach of fleas, these vermin. And there are a number of types of fleas that can carry it, but the rat flea, Xenopsilis chiopus, is the most effective agent of transmission, which means that you have these fleas that contain the bacillus, and they tend mostly, although not exclusively, to ride on the backs of black rats. And here, courtesy of IKEA, is a very attractive black rat, Ratus ratus. Yeah, we always like these visual props, and they're actually here, so we've used that one. In terms of the bacillus itself, actually, this is kind of a cute thing, although not cute. There's this company that makes plush toys of well-known bacteria and viruses. This is their plush toy for Y. pestis, and you can see to personalize it a little bit, it has these little beady blue eyes that kind of stare out at you. But if you look at it under a microscope, it doesn't look totally dissimilar to this, except it doesn't have a union tag or identification tag on it. But this is what they sell from that company in terms of little Bobby bacillus here. So you get the basic idea. They're not the scale, obviously. The bacillus is microscopic, whereas a rat, well, this is pretty close to a life-size version of a certain type of rat. So anyway, you have this bacillus in the stomach of fleas. Rats carry fleas, obviously, so that's a way for things to move fairly rapidly. It is a disease that's enzootic, generally speaking. In other words, it's in animal populations until it breaks out into large pandemics in human populations. And this should sound a little bit familiar because you have the speculation about the coronavirus and its origins, and the claim is that it may have something to do with bats and something that jumped from the bat population into the human population. And this is the case with a lot of viruses and influenzas. You have this thing called the swine flu, the H1N1, that hit back in 2009. And it's conceivable, in fact, during the summer of 2009, I had contracted it when I was in Bury St. Edmunds on a research trip. Or it could have been some other type of flu, whatever it was a horrific flu, and I was laid up in a hotel room, locked, not going out for several days while I got myself over it. And I traveled down to Prato to visit Professor Drell, who was on an Italian trip at that point. And even down in Prato the following week, I was still having some symptoms. It hadn't quite gone away, but I was good enough to travel and probably not contagious at that point, so I went down for that visit. So I never was tested for it, and so that's why I suspect it was probably the swine flu, because that's what was going on that summer in parts of England, although it could have just been a very bad flu of some other type, who knows. But in any case, it's these things that break into human populations, and under normal circumstances, the plague rarely moved from rats to humans because of cultural factors. We try to limit our contact with these types of animals. But there are some things that can alter the dynamic of contact between human and animal populations, and that allows these diseases from being enzootic to break out into a human pandemic. And so if you're looking for sorts of similarities between the coronavirus and the Black Death, this might be one of them, to a degree that you can demonstrate that the coronavirus began in an animal population of some sort and then jumped into a human population. And a lot of people seem to be relatively certain about that. Although I should reemphasize, and it's something I mentioned in editorial, in terms of the actual operation of the Black Death, I don't think it makes the best analogy, actually, to the coronavirus. And if you're looking for an analogy, the 1918 Spanish influenza would be a better analogy for what's going on now than what the Black Death would provide. Well, first of all, the Black Death is not a virus. It's bacteria. It's bacterial. It's not viral, for one thing. And the other reasons why I don't think it's the best analogy will become evident as we move on into the effects of it at a certain point. But anyway, for some reason, this thing jumps into the human population. There may have been some movements by rats for various reasons, and it's not clear why this would occur. It's perhaps due to ecological changes that may have driven rats closer to human populations in terms of large colonies. There are, in fact, some Islamic writers during the period who they're affected by it too. It appears in the Muslim world as well as the Christian world, as well as in Asia. And what they suggest in some of their chronicles is that the plague further east was preceded by famines, floods, and earthquakes, that there may have been some natural disasters that pushed the rat population, the rodent population, into closer contact with human populations, that broke these customs that develop over time that keep these populations more separate. And one thing you should keep in mind here, this is an issue that a lot of epidemiologists have addressed, that a lot of human customs from time immemorial may be based on a type of knowledge. In other words, that the way certain human populations live, customs they follow, may have arisen from some awareness that if you do certain things another way, then you have something like transmission of certain types of diseases into human populations. And once these customs are broken or severed, some disaster causes people, both and animal populations, to behave differently, that's when you would have this sort of transmission. And so that's a way of thinking about it. The evidence here is in no way categorical, but it's a way perhaps of trying to make sense of what happened. In any instance, even if the rats aren't moving as much as you might expect, the fleas can survive for some period without having an animal host. They can jump into spices, into cloth shipments or something like that. Particularly in grain or spices, they could survive perhaps up to 80 days without an animal host, which would be long enough to move of trade goods. And this would be another means of transmission where ships could bring it in even independently of the level of rat infestation on a particular ship, although obviously on ships you have rats, and that would be another means of transmission. But it explains some of what was going on, and it also confirms people in their perceptions that these ships were problematic. Now, in terms of this particular disease as we know it, Yersinia pestis, it assumes three forms, and we're going to deal with them from the medieval perspective in terms of mortality rates. It's a little bit different in terms of how people contend with them in modernity. So I'm going to draw a bit of a line there. But the most basic version, the one that you're most likely to get, is the bubonic plague. This is the one with which people are most familiar. And there are a couple of means of transmission of the bubonic plague. A flea jumps on you. A flea bites you. And in the process of biting you, which is what fleas do, they regurgitate some of the blood that they have on their interior, which contains the bacillus, into the wound they've created by biting you. And as the epidemiologists talk about it with the fleas, because the fleas are filled with these plague bacillus, they get blocked or looking to bite and regurgitate at that point. So that allows the bacillus to enter the human host. Or another way is if you have an open wound and flea feces get into the wound, that's another means of transmission apparently. And so there are a couple of ways that a human can contract, and the most common is just by a flea bite. And we alluded to this a little bit in towns. We mentioned this notion of sanitation and levels of personal hygiene during the Middle Ages. Not great. Everybody had fleas, everybody had lice, virtually without exception. It was something that was somewhat universal. Obviously, if you were at an upper level, the socioeconomic strata, you might not have it as badly, but it was part of the universal human condition. Personal cleanliness was not at a level that we would find acceptable now. As a matter of fact, it was considered sort of a romantic thing back then to hang around with your paramour so you could delouse each other, basically. Just a fun thing to do while you're hanging out together, particularly during a lockdown like this. God, what could be better than that? Anyway, once the bacillus enters the human body, it attacks the lymphatic system, the lymph nodes. The bacillus is carried by the lymphatic system to the nearest regional lymph node. The bacilli then multiply into larger colonies over the course of 3 to 8 days. So it attacks the lymphatic system fairly aggressively. The first sign of illness is a sudden feeling of coldness, followed by a pricking sensation like pins and needles. That's what most people describe as happening. And then this is followed by extreme fatigue and depression. You really get the blues at this point. As it goes on, you begin to develop these things called buboes, and that's where you get the name bubonic plague. What a bubo is a big tumor-like thing that you would see developing in places where you have major lymph glands, lymph nodes, and if we were in class, we would do sort of a little anatomy back and forth where you would tell me immediately that you have a lot of them under your neck, you have them underarms, you have them in the groin area. And so that's where the buboes would appear. They would be anywhere from the size of, say, lemon up to a grapefruit. These are big, obvious growths. And then 3 or 4 days after the formation of the buboes, and you have a high fever by this point. That's the other symptom that comes in. A very high fever. 3 or 4 days after the formation of buboes, the bacillus moves into the bloodstream. It infects the spleen, the lungs, and sometimes the brain. What some people did during the Middle Ages as a type of treatment is they would try to lance the buboes. And if we were in class, I would show you a lot of images, but I didn't see the point of belaboring that here. But we have these medical texts where you see illustrated the lancing of buboes to try to save a plague victim. And the anecdotal feeling at the time is this sometimes would work, that if they could lance and drain the buboes, you had a better chance of survival. So that was one treatment that they would try to give a person in order to get a plague victim past the plague. Then, at this point, as you're moving into the later phases of the disease, you begin to have subcutaneous hemorrhaging, bleeding internally, which means that you begin to develop black and blue spots. And this is where you get the notion of Black Death, sometimes called the Blue Death, because of the subcutaneous hemorrhaging. You begin to smell very badly. You throw off a stench. Your breath becomes fetid like you've been on a 2-week bender. And you begin to effectively pee black because you have blood in your urinary system. In other words, you have a lot of internal hemorrhaging because of it. It is a disgusting, humiliating, and degrading death. It's really one of the most awful ways you can conceive of to go, which was also part of the reason why people found it to be so horrific. You knew it was coming, it was highly infectious, and it was devastating in its symptoms. Just a horrible way to go. If you contract a disease, in this society, it was about 90% fatal. You didn't have a great chance of recovery. About 10% of the people would, having contracted, but 9 out of 10 die. And this is part of the reason why I don't think that, obviously, the Black Death is such a great analogy to the coronavirus, because the coronavirus is obviously a very devastating disease. There's no question about that. And it's pretty infectious too. It spreads relatively easy. It spreads apparently about 3 times more easily than common influenza does. And it has a higher death rate than influenza. The death rate, has been calculated to be somewhere between at least 10 times worse than the common flu, and about a bit more than that. But the larger point is that 80% of the people who contract it never require hospitalization. They can recover at home. 20% end up in the hospital. But within that number, a fair number of those actually manage to survive it as well. As far as they're trying to get at death rates, it varies from country to country, in terms of the information that we have now. But what you're hearing is anywhere between 2 and 8%, mostly down on the lower level, which makes it vastly less fatal if you contract it than the Black Death. The Black Death was a vastly more devastating pandemic when it occurred. If you caught this, you probably were going to die of it, and in a very horrible way at that. That's why it's become such a watershed event, not just because of the demographic impact, but because of the sheer numbers of people that died and the way they died. This form of plague generally occurred during the summer months when the fleas and rats were most active. And the claim is that it's more difficult for the bacillus to multiply in colder temperatures. So there was a claim that there's a type of seasonality to it. However, this type of plague is not transmitted through human contact. I don't touch you and give it to you. If I'm standing close to you, a flea might jump from me to you, and the flea could give it to you, but I'm not doing it. It's the flea that's doing it. So you could touch people who have it without necessarily contracting it, as long as you're not transferring fleas from that person that have the bacillus. It's always the fleas that represent what you call the vector, the means of transmission, as epidemiologists would express it when you're talking about Yersinia pestis. Now, the second type is the pneumonic type of it. It's the same bacillus, but the effect's somewhat different. This is when the respiratory system is attacked, obviously. That's why they call it pneumonic. This would be caused when victims contracted both the plague and pneumonia. And what would happen, and this obviously this would occur mostly during winter. So as in terms of the bubonic, the claim is that seasonality is a summer disease. The pneumonic plague would be more of a winter disease. And uh, you would know this would be happening when people would start coughing blood up, that it's causing hemorrhaging within your lungs. And this coughing and exhalation could spread the disease because the bacillus could be basically aerosolized and become airborne. And this is something that's a little closer to what you see with the coronavirus. You know what our instructions are, that if you can maintain a 6 feet in distance between people, if somebody coughs or sneezes, that's probably considered a fairly safe zone, that the virus will be aerosolized. It can be put out into the atmosphere, but you're probably far enough away that if you're just walking in passing and you get away, the expectation is that you're not that likely to contract it. If the person is wearing a face mask, then that would keep them from spreading it. You know, it would reduce the radius a bit. And if you're wearing a face mask too, that might help you. Although the advice that you hear is that it's the face mask, it's most effective in keeping people from spreading it in case they cough from somebody. And if you have to be close to somebody, if you can't maintain the 6 feet of distance, then the face mask for everybody becomes a good idea at that point. And I think it's going to be a general thing. Actually, I had a couple of old face masks I bought years ago to do some painting, so we actually have some medical face masks here, although we haven't used them. And my wife has been demonstrating her talent. She's creating some for us with the little sewing machines she ordered. We haven't felt a need to use it because we walk at 5:30 in the morning and nobody's out at that point. So if you're by yourself, you don't worry about that stuff too much. It may become a much more general thing, and obviously the CDC is recommending that it become a more general thing as we're dealing with the coronavirus. But so this is a form of the plague that would be more similar in terms of means of transmission to the coronavirus, although it's a bacillus and not a virus. Uh, in terms of death, it was by anoxia, lack of oxygen, and by cardiac failure. Basically, if you got this, it was nearly 100% fatal. You probably weren't going to recover from it, and death was usually in 1 to 2 days. The other version is septicemic, and this is where it attacks the bloodstream fairly directly. And it's usually, from the medieval perspective, to the degree that you knew that somebody had it, it was supposed to be about 100% fatal within 24 hours. It was extremely rare during the Middle Ages. Now, as I read about, the current understanding of it, people now find the pneumonic to be more deadly because people think it's something else. They put off doing anything about it just because it's a cough. And by the time they get around to doing something about it, it may have gotten too late to do a lot about it. But it acted so quickly, the septicemic version, that there was no time for buboes to form. And so you didn't have that degrading element. It was a quicker death if you got it, but it was relatively rare and also pretty much 100% fatal. So if you're going to surviving it, bubonic would be the one you could probably have a shot at surviving, conceivably. Now, so this is the traditional story. Ever since, our study of bacteria has allowed us to know what things are, and the bacillus has been identified, people for the longest time thought that this was actually the bubonic plague. But could it be something else that caused this mortality during the Middle Ages? Some other disease? From time to time, you have some dissenting voices where they suggest that maybe it wasn't Yersinia pestis, maybe it was something else. One of the best known of them, and these are all people who are still alive as far as I know. In the case of most of them, I know for a fact they're still alive. One of the main dissenters, this guy back in the 80s, mid-80s, wrote a book where he reappraised the Black Death. It's a guy named Graham Twigg. And interesting book. Got a Xerox copy of it in storage. So I've had to read it at one point or another and look at it from time to time. What he suggested is that it was anthrax. That's a disease that often affects sheep, that it was somehow transferred to the human population. And he thinks that anthrax fits the disease that people describe in the Middle Ages better than bubonic plague or pneumonic plague or septicemic plague or than Y. pestis. And so that's been out there. So that was a dissenting voice back in the 80s. And then right around the turn of the millennium, around the year 2000, you have a number of people beginning to make alternative suggestions about it. Perhaps the best known of them is a man named Samuel Cone, who actually is a great medievalist. Know him personally, actually. My wife's known him personally even longer than I have for reasons too complicated to go into here. But what Sam did is he produced first an article that appeared in the American Historical Review, which is expanded into a book and called The Black Death with a subtitle. Um, and he looked at how the plague was described by contemporaries who saw it during the 14th century, and he looked at the evidence that we have for rates of mortality to a degree that we can reconstruct it, rates of infection, and seasonality of the plague, and what its spread was geographically, where it was, and when. And by looking at these things carefully, he began to think that maybe this isn't Yersinia pestis. We know what Yersinia pestis is. We had big outbreaks of bubonic plague in India and China in the 19th century. And the reason why we know so much about it is that there were a lot of British physicians who were working in both India and China during that period who worked with plague victims. And part of the reason for their initial identification of it is that they were very well-educated men. During that period in the 19th century, if you were a physician, you also had a very good classical education in Latin and Greek and in history. And these people were aware of the 14th century plague as a historical phenomenon. And so for them, in terms of this disease they saw, they thought, well, maybe it's that. And that's why you begin to get this backwards connection of the Black Death with Yersinia pestis. But as Samuel Cone looks at the disease that we know about in the 19th century as it's described, and we know about it down to the present day, as I'll talk about before we end this thing up, he just did not see what was going on in the 14th century as being exactly the same thing. He said that the behavior of the 14th century disease seemed very different to him. And you have other people coming to sort of a similar conclusion. There was this two-person team. One of them was basically a historical demographer. The other one was a biology person, Susan Scott and Christopher Duncan, who speculated that what was going on in the 14th century was not Yersinia pestis, but some sort of hemorrhagic fever, something sort of along the lines of modern Ebola, a virus rather than a bacillus, that spread through human contact, not through rats or fleas. And they wrote a couple of books where they tried to work out that scenario, and they're doing this at roughly the same time Sam Cone is doing his early work on it. Actually, funny thing, my wife and I were in Italy for the academic year 2000-2001. She had this very good deal at this place called the American Academy in Rome, and I went along for the ride since I didn't have anything better going on that year. And so we spent the year in Rome, which was great, and that's where I actually first met Sam Cone. He was there for a stay, and interesting, he gave actually a very primordial version of a talk at the Academy that year where he put out these ideas because he was working on them leading up to the article in the book that eventually came out. And so I got sort of an advanced kind of sort of formulation on it. And he was very interested to talk to me because he heard that actually I had some understanding of the Black Death in England, which I do for various reasons. That's why I felt comfortable enough about it to do an editorial for the Times-Dispatch to try to calm people down a little bit, which was the larger purpose of it, and to encourage people to do what's being asked of them to do as much as possible while not letting their social bonds fray too severely as a result of it. And so we had lunch one day at a little cafe not too far from the American Academy and had a long discussion. And he was concerned about England because as he went into the evidence in England, there are elements of evidence in England that might tend to cause a little bit of a problem with his argument, and that's what we talked about largely at that point. Since I was just hearing about this and not able to read the evidence systematically, I remained sort of agnostic on the question, although I found what he was suggesting to be fascinating on any number of levels. And I should point out here that having these big questions asked by people like Sam Cone, who are willing to go out on a limb, although he didn't go so far out on a limb that he named a different disease, he just said he didn't think it was Y. pestis, or if it's Y. pestis, we need to improve our understanding of it, how it affects different populations at different times, which is an interesting suggestion in and of itself. I remained very much an agnostic on it at the time because I would need to see more and read more before you would think about upsetting this. thing that we've assumed for a long time. But the larger point about that is that even if the idea sometimes is erroneous, if it comes out to be a grand failure, what it does compel people to do is to look at the question harder and to reevaluate the evidence. And that's never a bad thing, because the fact of the matter is there's always more evidence for the Middle Ages and for most periods being accumulated over time. And in some cases, our ability to evaluate the evidence improves. And different methods can be brought to bear to resolve issues a little bit better. And so I always find these debates to be useful. It allows people to re-examine. You don't want to be operating, I guess, what I'm trying to say here in the broadest sense. You never want to be operating entirely on a priori assumptions. In other words, assumptions that you hold that you think are so solid that they should never be examined again. A priori assumptions can be problematic. And what debates like this do is they compel people to reevaluate the evidence and to rethink it. And if you come back to your original assumption, that's great, but at least you've taken the effort to come back to that original assumption by evaluating all the evidence that's available. And so there you have that, where he puts that out there. Now, at about the same time, however, you begin to see appearing on the scene scientific evidence, in the absolute sense of scientific evidence, where people are beginning to use DNA evidence to try to address this issue. And the question then is, where do you get DNA evidence from a disease that was occurring back in the 14th century? Well, there's this very clever French team. They were the first to really do it, and actually at least one of you is addressing this as a paper topic, and you bumped into the initial article or one of them that they put out. This French team went into some cemeteries. Initially, they went to a cemetery in Marseille. They exhumed what they believed to be plague corpses, and they're looking for portions of a body, of course, that you'd have a better chance of some DNA, genetic material being preserved. The place where you would probably have the best chance of finding this material preserved is in intact teeth. If you can find teeth that haven't been exploded or broken in some way, the interior pulp of the tooth will contain genetic material. And so what they did is they went through these corpses that they assumed to be plague corpses. They extracted genetic material from these unexploded teeth from the pulp, and they did DNA testing on it. And what they were discovering was Yersinia pestis. That they were convinced by that initially that, yeah, this is the plague. The plague, as we understand it in the modern era, what was affecting China and India in the late 19th century. Now, of course, there was a rebuttal to this because they were using evidence from Marseille. Marseille was one of the last places that had the plague appear in the 1720s, and people began to argue, well, this doesn't prove anything because the plague could have come in subsequent to this by another avenue, and what's happening in the 14th century could have been a different disease. And so this team, mostly the same team, they then went into what was a known plague cemetery in France from the 14th century. They did the same procedure, got the same result, more or less. And as time has gone on, there's been a further accumulation of DNA evidence. The most obvious recent one is that there's a known plague cemetery in East Smithfield in London, which is actually fairly close to the Tower of London. For those of you who've been to the city, there's a big market there too during the Middle Ages. It's not far from the city of London, the business district there. And from that plague cemetery, further DNA testing was done in the aughts leading into our own just past decade, and all the DNA evidence now seems to be ending up on more or less the same page, that this is Yersinia pestis, not even much of a mutated form, but pretty close to the Yersinia pestis that you would see in the modern world. Now, there's a lot of back and forth on this. The part of the problem, obviously, with the modern plague, as we know about it in India and China and elsewhere, is that the infection rate doesn't seem to be anywhere nearly as high as what you see in the 14th century, where lots of people are getting it. It's pretty ugly if you get it at any time. But the infection rates in the more modern ones didn't seem to be quite as great. The disease didn't seem to move as quickly through human populations. And what some people argued as type of a rebuttal to this, that there are times when it can maybe mutate slightly and become hyper-virulent. And so it would still be the same disease, but for some reason at this point, maybe the 14th century was a hyper-virulent period. So you had all this argumentation going back and forth, which is fascinating. It's on the level of scientific evidence, and it always leaves more historians with more standard historical training kind of a spot, because historians like to evaluate evidence on their own. You know, I'm a documents person. Uh, I love medieval documents, and so I like the feel of them. I like the look of them. I like the fact that I can read the damn Latin in them, and I can do the paleography. I've spent a fair amount of time learning how to do that crap, and so I'm very much document-based person. But I'm also interested in this issue. And I am not a scientist. I can do a certain type of quantification, but I'm not a math whiz and I'm not a science whiz. If I were that, I might be doing something different. And the point here is it places historians of a more conventional nature, people like me, in kind of an unusual spot, because you're having to rely on other people for these assessments of the evidence. But I will say at this point that I'm well enough satisfied that it is probably Yersinia pestis. There could have been other things going on at the time as well, but for the evidence that, as I see it now, it seems like they have mostly resolved this issue. But it leaves this open question, because if you look at the accounts of it, Sam Cohn still has a big point, a very valid point. No matter how you slice it, the disease seems to be behaving differently in the 14th century in some respects than it does now. And this gets you to this issue of what do you even mean by disease, because the consequence of disease can be affected by environmental factors, factors in people, social factors. All of these things come into play. And so it tells you that if you're going to assume that this is Yersinia pestis back in the 14th century, you need to be more sophisticated in how you understand the disease to try to come to some sort of reconciliation with what the evidence is telling you, if that makes any sense at all. So it's a fascinating debate. And I should note, since I'm not, it's a huge issue for the history of medicine. If you are a historian of medicine, this is a fascinating thing and a very important issue. Since I'm not a historian of medicine, obviously, it's not so significant for me personally. I'm more interested in the social and economic and cultural effects of the plague. And viewed from that perspective, the important thing is not precisely what the disease was, but it was its behavior and level of mortality. That becomes the significant factor for it, because in terms of the effects it had on the society, as you see the Middle Ages beginning to make the transition to early modernity, it's the gross mortality that makes the difference. The identity of the disease, not so much. It becomes sort of an academic issue for people who are interested in these other issues. And this leads us to how people responded to this. What did they do as a reaction to it? Well, as you can probably gather, Western Europeans were uncertain of the cause. There was a lot of rampant speculation about what caused this. In a very pious society, which it's a very Christian society, the wrath of God is usually a fairly satisfying explanation. And actually, even with the coronavirus, I've seen some people beginning to make that same suggestion, that the coronavirus is a punishment for a society's sinfulness. You can take that for whatever it's worth one way or another. Obviously, it's a much more compelling explanation for people in the 14th century. And so that's out there, and it's something to keep in mind as we move on. From a more academic perspective, people did go to the universities at this point, which are fully running, and they would ask for modern medical opinion as it existed then, what was considered modern, what the universities thought. And they would frequently give astrological reasons for it, that there's a misalignment of the planets, which is causing disease to come into the population for various reasons. They also need to bear in mind that during this period, in terms of the knowledge of human medicine, it was humoral medicine, which I don't think I placed on a transparency. The notion that the human body was composed of four humors, essentially. Blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and that disease was fundamentally caused by imbalances in the humors. And this is something that could be caused by diet. It could also be caused for astrological reasons, for that matter. There are various factors that can play into it. That's why up until really into the modern era, before we learned about the human body anatomy and how the human body worked in a more modern scientific way, you would still have bleeding as a treatment, because this is just to reduce the amount of blood based upon the assumption that there's a humoral imbalance, and this would redress it in some fashion. So maybe some people saw it sort of that way as well. Other people felt that the disease was miasma of some sort, kind of a cloud that's emanating from the ground. Some people associate it with floods and earthquakes, that maybe the natural disasters were causing it in some fashion. There are some people who believe that you could transmit the plague by putting your eyes out on a stalk and looking at people in a very, yeah, like that. That it's kind of the evil eye sort of thing. These are things I actually mentioned in passing in that newspaper editorial, because I thought there was a reason to build up to the notion that some people engaged in conspiracy theories, that there began to circulate all kinds of crazy ideas, as is wont to happen when you have a major disaster like this, where the most prevalent one was this notion that somebody was poisoning the wells, poisoning the water supply. And in this instance, when you see this sort of thing, the majority of the population will think that it's somebody that's marginal to their daily existence, which meant that they would target the poor and they would target Jewish populations. And so you had some very violent attacks on Jewish populations, the decimation of some Jewish populations in some cities during this period. And I want to elaborate on this a little bit because there's been some very problematic behavior since the coronavirus struck. Uh, we had this incident on campus where some very nasty things were yelled at a student from China, because obviously the coronavirus, in terms of our understanding of it, broke out first there and then was transmitted from China. Since we're a global world, that it would be transmitted elsewhere is no big surprise. But I can't say this strongly enough and reiterate it too many times. No individual person or group of people is responsible for this. It's a frigging disease. It is spread, by various types of human contact, but nobody bears any sort of blame for this. It's just one of those things. It happens in human history. And for people to go down some sort of xenophobic rabbit hole and start blaming Chinese people for this and mistreating Asian people generally because of this, I find that appalling to a degree I can barely express with words. I know you're all good people, and I would assume none of this happened with any of you, or this would have even have crossed your minds. But unfortunately, we've had quite a few incidents of that, and I really wish people to express it in kind. I wish people would pull their heads out of their rear ends over this. And then there are the other conspiracy theories. There's one over the internets right now, and about how 5G transmission towers, as we move to 5G telephones and cellular transmission, is making people more susceptible to the coronavirus. There have been a number of efforts in Great Britain in particular for people to try to burn or vandalize transmission towers. And it is an unfortunate reality that some fairly important American celebrities have actually spouted this nonsense online. Uh, and this tells you one of the problems with modern social media and the internet. A bad idea can spread very rapidly. And if you have one person who's well known express that idea to, you have somebody put on a damn tinfoil hat and start spouting this nonsense, it leads people to believe it. And so there's another conspiracy theory that it's some sort of conspiracy against Donald Trump. I mean, please, you know. And so I just, I don't like to editorialize too much in this, but this is nut job stuff. And I really hope that if you have any friends or family members who begin to spout this nonsense, that you push back on it a little bit. This is difficult enough for everybody without people going completely off the deep end. And that's part of the reason why I mentioned in that editorial that you have these crazy conspiracy theories appear and they lead to very bad things sometimes. And we don't want that going on as this other business is going on. And so I'm going to say that, and now we can leave that one alone. I always assume, since you all seem to be really great people to me, that this isn't even an issue with any of you. But if you hear about it, try to put, I would count it a great personal favor if you try to push back on it a little bit and try to talk some sense into people about that thing. Editorial over. So people were uncertain. You have all these things going on, and these causes are not mutually exclusive. You can link up humoral medicine with astrology, with miasmas from the earth and natural disasters. You can create sort of a broad theory. Unfortunately, none of that's true, but that's how people try to get at it. How do people respond to it? Well, in individual instances, people did try to isolate themselves. So this social distancing thing, there was a practice of it during the Middle Ages. People would often flee the city for their country estates if they had a way of doing that. And they probably did reduce their susceptibility to disease through less density of population and maybe less exposure to rats and fleas. Now, that's a possibility. The papacy was in Avignon at that point, and the Pope apparently locked himself up in a hall in Avignon and had his meals slid under the door. So he isolated himself from people. And, with something that can be transmitted by fleas jumping from person to person, that could be a somewhat effective strategy to try to survive it. Some people took a different tact. They sort of adopted the Prince 1999 philosophy, and you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. But Prince, the late pop singer, of whom I have been an inordinate fan for a very long time, he's part of my generation's cultural references. One of his big hits early on was a song called 1999, where he would say that uh, at 2000 parties over, oops, out of time, so tonight we got a party like it's 1999. He was saying this back in the mid 80s, actually, but take that for whatever it's worth. The point here that some people decided that, we're all going to die. And so if we're going to die, we might as well die as happily as we can die. And they begin to engage in high grade debauchery. You would see sort of roving parties from place to place to place, people assuming that it's going to end for them anyway, so they might as enjoy whatever time they have as aggressively as they can enjoy it. And so there was some of that going on. It was sort of the Bobby McFerrin, don't worry, be happy model for coping with the Black Death. And as we already mentioned, you had these pogroms where the Jews were accused of poisoning wells, and there was a belief that if you eliminated Jews, you could end the plague. People seem to lose track of the fact that the Jews were dying of the same thing, which kind of undercuts the validity of your conspiracy theory. But anyway, in England, this was less of a problem because the Jews had been ejected from England in 1290, but it was clearly a continental phenomenon of great gravity. It did occur, and we have some horrific accounts of what was done to some of these Jewish communities during this period. Of course, if you assume it's divine wrath, the obvious response to that is extreme piety. You go from debauchery on one end to piety on the other. As the plague is hitting England, the Archbishop of York saw it coming, and he ordered that processions be done prophylactically to try to ward it off, to keep it from entering the city. And so processions were done. There were attempts to do penance to lessen the wrath of God, to show contrition for sin, and to ask for a type of absolution for it. In the standard, sacramental penitential system that you have within the church. And in some instances, this search for penance became extreme. You have the appearance in Europe of something called the flagellant movement. There have been flagellant groups in Europe since the 13th century. There were nothing absolutely new, but these are groups that are determined to do extreme public penances because they assume that society is very sinful and bad things could happen as a consequence of that sinfulness. The plague gave the movement new impetus. It really made it a much larger and more aggressive movement. The way this would work is you would have maybe several hundred to 1,000 people join into a flagellant movement, and they would be led by a master. And in the ideal sense, as it's described in some chronicles, they would go on a 33-day tour together, 1 year for every year of the life of Christ, or the same age I was at when I got married, and I'll leave that one to you again. They go into a town, they form up into a circle in the town square, and they as a group drop to the ground, and they are flagellated by the master for their sins. What flagellation is just beating, basically across the back. And what they apparently would use, they would use sort of more like a cat o' nine tails thing with little metal hooks, little metal pins in the end of it to cause significant effusion of blood as a result of this. So they'd be flagellated by the master. After that, there would be collective flagellation, where the dynamic was, well, I'll hit your back and you can hit mine, sort of like in, oh, it's an image my wife has never liked, but it's original with me. Sort of a sadomasochistic bunny hop would be organized at that point. So the scourges were severe. These flagellants, when they would move into a town, they would do 2 shows a day of this, not to make it sound cinematic, and sometimes an evening performance, which leads people to the question, well, were they hurting themselves that badly? Because you couldn't survive that very long if you were really, really laying into yourself and you were going to do it for 33 days. But it does spread the movement across Europe from the east, Eastern Europe into Central Europe into Western Europe. We should note here that it was largely a continental phenomenon, that it didn't jump the channel much. We only have one reported instance of this type of procession for England. It occurs in London, which isn't surprising. An urban center would be the obvious place in which you would have a flagellant procession occur. It is eventually condemned by the Pope as a movement and suppressed by the crown heads of Europe. They don't think that this is a legitimate way to do penance to blunt God's wrath for the Black Death. As a cinematic matter, some of you may have already seen this film, and I think I may have even referred to it in an earlier lecture. Ingmar Bergman made this movie called The Seventh Seal, and it is on virtually everyone's top 10 list of the greatest films made in cinematic history. It is in beautiful black and white in Swedish with subtitles, and even though it's an older film, much older, it was made back in the 50s, you guys are probably, even at your age, familiar with one of the stars of the film. The main character in it was a man named Maximilian Schell, very famous actor who died within the last couple or 3 years. I don't remember precisely when. The context in which you would know him would be in the most recent set of Star Wars films. He appeared in The Force Awakens. He's at the very beginning of the film. He's the elderly gentleman that Poe Dameron is meeting with, who is giving him what looks like a little flash drive, which has the map on it. That's Maximilian Schell. It's one of the last movies he made prior to his death in a very long, exceedingly distinguished career. The man has been in a ton of movies. He's a great actor. In The Seventh Seal, he plays a knight, a Swedish knight, it's set in Sweden, who's been on crusade. He is returning from crusade, and he's coming back with his right-hand man, his squire. And as he arrives back in his home region in Sweden, the Black Death is hitting. And as he is in a town there, he actually witnesses a very sanitized version of a flagellant procession. If you haven't seen the movie, I strongly urge you to see it, because in addition to dealing with some themes of the Black Death, it deals generally with the medieval conception of life and death. And part of the film is this very famous continuing thing where the knight is trying to extend his life by playing this continuing game of chess with death. This was not something that Ingmar Bergman made up as a conceit. You see this depicted in late medieval stained glass windows. It was a late medieval theme of art, of notion of trying to play a game of life and death with chess to extend your life, knowing that you are eventually going to lose. In addition to that, it contains a scene at the very end of a medieval theme called the Dance Macabre, or the Dance of Death, where death with the scythe and the whole 9 yards comes to meet those who have died and to lead them away into sort of a dancing procession. And you see this depicted first in a mural inside a church that the knight visits, and at the very end you see it happening with a bunch of people who have been the knight's companions as they have perished to the plague. And so it deals in a really great way. It's not an upper of a film. It can be considered kind of a downer, but it's a beautiful movie, a very well-made movie, and it is one of the great movies of all time. And so if we were in the late medieval course, and where I do a much more expanded discussion of all of this, I would have had you see the film. For our course, not so much. It's set in Sweden. But, keep that in mind. Put it on your list of things to eventually get around to viewing. You can get it on almost any platform, actually. And you can feel more cultured because it is considered a great, if you want to be pretentious about it, it's one of the greatest examples of the filmic art of all time. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, so put it on your recommendation list. And since we're doing recommendations, you may or may not have wondered how my wife and I are entertaining ourselves during our seclusion. Um, what we've been doing is watching a great thing, and if you're looking for something you can watch over a fair number of nights, we're currently watching Foyle's War, um, which is just a great series made in England. It deals with a detective in southern England during the Second World War and his experience there, and it's one of the most beautiful things that I think was ever have been put on television. It was given to my wife and me as a gift by her parents. I have very generous in-laws back, I think about 7 or 8 years ago. It's been a while ago, and I couldn't persuade Joanna to watch it at the time, so I watched the first couple of seasons sitting down here in my little hole. And I thought it was so good that I stopped at that point. There are 8 seasons of it, or 8 sets of it. They don't call them seasons. And I've held off on it until I could persuade Joanna to actually watch it with me. And I've tried over the years. And finally, since we have to be sitting here, I finally persuaded her to watch the first episode, and she was immediately hooked. And we just finished the third set last night. We're going to continue through to the end of it. We're watching it on the weekends, basically, a set or two a weekend. And so if you're looking for something to watch, I would strongly urge you to watch that. It's fantastic. And if your parents are around, they'd love it too. I think everybody who watches this loves it. It's just a fantastic series if you haven't seen it already. But that's neither here nor there. So you have the flagellant processions. They're suppressed. After the plague passed from England, the Archbishop of Canterbury ordered people to offer prayers of thanksgiving for their survival, that they were so grateful it had finally left that it should be something they should celebrate and be thankful for. And so that's how the wrath of God issue was confronted in England. Another point about the Black Death, to shift gears again and get back to epidemiology, it was a recurring plague. You have the worst one in the late 1340s, early 1350s. You have many subsequent local and national outbreaks. The outbreaks in the 15th century, if you think about it pan-Europeanly, they were almost too numerous to count. Few areas totally escaped subsequent outbreaks. It usually wasn't, death rate wasn't as high, generally speaking, in these subsequent outbreaks, but it remained significant, enough where you would certainly notice it. And in terms of England in the 14th century, you have another outbreak in 1361-62, another one in 1369, one in 1375, so on and so forth. It would appear in some part of England pretty frequently, and some of those became almost national in scope. The ghost of the Black Death hung over England until the end of the 15th century in terms of something that would recur with fair regularity, and it was a continuing break upon population during that period. In its last appearance in England occurs in 1660, runs through about 1665, the same era of the Great Fire in London. After that, it doesn't reappear in England. The last appearance in Europe was in 1720 in Marseille, about 60 years later. I will remind you, and some of you already know this, that the Yersinia pestis bacillus is indigenous in some areas of the western United States, and you find pockets of it in various places in the world. It's very severe in Madagascar, that island off the eastern coast of Africa. It pops up in various places. And the question is, of course, why? Why is Yersinia pestis in the western United States? Best explanation is obviously the connections with Asia, because you have major outbreaks of Yersinia pestis in Asia in the late 19th century, in India, on the subcontinent, and in China. And trade transport across the Pacific is probably the avenue by which this reaches the western United States. The earliest outbreak in terms of it being epidemic in the U.S. is in San Francisco, 1900 to 1904, where you do have Yersinia pestis in the city of San Francisco fairly severely. Between 1900 and 1915, there have been 1,036 documented cases of Yersinia pestis in the United States. And to give you a little more compact thing of time to get your head around, in 1944 to 1994, a 50-year period, late Second World War to the mid-90s, there were 362 cases of it diagnosed, every one of them either in California, New Mexico, or Arizona, the West and the Southwest in the United States. And I will give you a personal anecdote now. My wife and I were married in her parents' backyard on August the 7th, 1993. We've been married a while. God, has it been that long? We've been up on 27 years now. And for our honeymoon, well, actually, we'd sort of taken our honeymoons in advance. We took two special trips because we'd been in Europe, both of us on Fulbright the preceding year. And so we took a special trip up to the lakes in England. And then, since she was in Italy, we had a special vacation down on the Amalfi Coast because we could justify it to ourselves taking some special trips prior to getting married. We got married later, after just a couple or 3 months after we got back from Europe that year. And then, since we were going to be on the East Coast, we were going to be in Providence. Joanna was in graduate school in Brown, so we were going to be there. I was going to work remotely. I was still in graduate school at Ohio State at that point. Uh, we drove across country. And the night before we were supposed to depart, we got married. We're going to leave a couple of days later and go the southern route, stop in Kentucky to visit my family, then stop in Columbus to pick up all the stuff I'd placed into storage, and a lot of her stuff as well, because we'd spent some time together in Columbus together before departing to Europe. Uh, we had this long drive. The night before we were supposed to depart, we get a news flash that in Yosemite, where we wouldn't be passing too far from that, one of the big national parks in California, they'd seen a bunch of dead rodents, and they determined that it was actually the plague that was killing them, Yersinia pestis. And so we were just sort of passing through. It wasn't going to affect us particularly, but it appears in the western U.S., and probably because it came over from Asia. Some people speculate that a lot of Chinese labor was brought over to work on the railroads in the West, and that may have had something to do with it, But Asia was obviously the most obvious place where it would have come from, since you're on the Pacific Rim. And it's endemic in the animal populations out there, rodent populations of various sorts. Uh, Now, to bring it a little bit closer to home, well, you've had some spikes in cases. It still exists. There was a spike in cases back in 2015, where about 16 people contracted it, virtually all out in the western United States. Um, there was a particular case that made the news back in 2002. And this one was a fascinating one, where you have a couple visiting New York City, middle-aged, and they suddenly start getting very sick. And they're trying to figure out what's going on. It seems sort of flu-like. They go seek medical attention. The husband seems to be much more severely affected by it than the wife. They decide, yeah, this couple, they seem to have the bubonic plague. They have Yersinia pestis. The gentleman got so sick that they had to place him in a medically induced coma. He was having terrible internal hemorrhaging. He was beginning to get the sort of subcutaneous stuff going on. It was so severe, in fact, that they ended up, because of the internal bleeding, having to amputate both legs. He survived. They eventually were able, after amputating the legs, giving him sufficient time to recover, he recovered from it. His wife recovered more intact. Her case seemed to be a little less severe, but people were wondering, well, in New York City, is it in New York City? The immediate answer was no. What had happened is that the couple was from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and they were sort of on the edge of the city. And what tends to be happening is as suburbs expand, you would have interference in local rodent populations, not necessarily rats. It can be prairie dogs, it can be groundhogs, it can be any number of things, actually. Squirrels, for that matter, can contract it and carry it. And as you expand suburbs, it can disturb these populations. And they claim, much to my wife's horror, there was a report that came out from the CDC back in '94 that actually can be transmitted by domestic cats. Actually, that the cat can get a flea, bring the flea in, give it to you. And the warning was that if you're in one of these suburban areas that are in process of expansion, uh, out in the Southwest, get your cat a really good flea collar. Be careful if you get these symptoms. Maybe you want to consider go seeing a doctor and doing something about it. But you had the spike in 2015, and has since subsided. But it's these states out in the Southwest, California, Arizona, New Mexico, apparently in Colorado a bit now as well. You'll see this pop up. So it still exists. You can contract it. But the larger point is, this is not something you have to die from it. Since it's bacterial, you get the right antibiotic and you will be right as rain after it. It's something that we can treat. This is where the coronavirus, obviously, again, it ceases to be a good analogy for it. Because with the coronavirus, it's a virus, not a bacterium. And we need a different sort of treatment for it. We need a vaccination to take care of this. And that's what has to be developed and will be developed, I'm quite confident, over the course of the next year or so. And that'll be the ultimate resolution of this once you get sufficient people vaccinated and enough people surviving having had it who might have natural immunity for the time. You probably want to vaccinate them eventually as well. Then you can say the disease can be conquered. But until we have that, there's no absolute certainty. And treatments, they're working on them. There are lots of things that you're hearing about, but there's nothing that the authorities have yet deemed to be either both effective and safe for people to use. And so if they develop treatments, then perhaps they can treat people more effectively who have it and reduce the mortality rate. But the ultimate solution will be a vaccination that will give people immunity to it so they can ward it off and not ever get the symptoms from it. That would be much, much better, and they'll eventually head in that way. But it's still something that's out there. This is a disease that has never left. It still is with us. It's not something that's eradicated. You hear overseas cases of it occasionally in China, in Madagascar, in Africa, various other places, where it will pop up every now and again. Now, this of course leads to the big ticket question: what were the death rates from the Black Death? This remains a point of some degree of scholarly debate. The Black Death was usually in any one locality only for several weeks or a month, which also makes it very different from the coronavirus, obviously. With the coronavirus, it's a more extended thing, and what we're trying to do is actually make it even more extended in the original onslaught to reduce the number of cases that hospitals have to treat at any one time. It's this flattening of the curve thing. It's better to have it extended out a bit than to have everybody get it at once and overwhelm the medical care system. And that's what we're trying to do by staying away from each other for the time being. And it's crucial, at least at this point, that people continue to do that. And this is where the analogy, again, breaks down just a little bit. The contemporary estimates of mortality tend to be greatly exaggerated because people were horrified by it. It's commonly claimed in chronicles that only 1/10 of the population survived. That's not true. Other chronicles suggested maybe 1/5 or 1/3 survived. That's getting a little closer to the mark, but still too high, probably. The figures are a measure of the degree of horror and disbelief. When you see something like this, it seems like everybody's dying because a lot of people were. And like for John Quinn of Kilkenny, he's thinking everybody could die ultimately, and he apparently died himself of it. But I should point out that there are no unambiguous estimates of mortality. We don't have census-like material. The figures we have are extrapolations on the evidence as it exists, where you have to engage in a range of assumptions and suppositions about what it actually means to try to get at a number. And if I were in class, there's this thing that I show you where I give you a document, a photograph of it, plus a transcription, plus a translation, because it's something I encountered that's never been published. It's an original Latin document from England from the period of the Black Death that illustrates all the difficulties of trying to get a mortality rate on these things. And maybe I'll post it for you so you can see what it is. I'll make a mental note to do that. But it's to the degree that we've been able to calculate it. If you think Europe-wide, death rates in any locale tended to range from 1/3 to 2/3 of the entire population, which again makes it much more severe than the coronavirus. With the coronavirus, we were thinking a max of 2 to 3% of the population in the worst possible case scenarios. This is vastly worse than that. And again, that's why the analogy breaks down to some degree. I don't think it fits best. In England, you tend to see death rates to a degree that they can calculate them there between 40% and 55%. So I'm thinking half is probably closer to the number. When I was expressing this in the editorial, I said 1/3 to 2/3 because that covers both ends of the possible range almost everywhere. As I read other people in newspapers trying to talk about it, they're all saying 1/3, which I think may undersell it a bit. But most of these people aren't authorities on it. They're just giving you what they read to some degree or what they've read somewhere. Some places were more heavily affected than others. Others felt a lesser impact from it. So there is some regional and local variation in the severity of the disease. Each locality was a little different. It was especially virulent in small communities in confined spaces. This means that monastic communities, they could really be decimated by it, and some of it were, where you see almost everybody getting killed because they're closed in with each other. Generally speaking, it was more virulent in cities and more fatal in cities than in the countryside, and this makes perfect sense. Poor sanitation provides a good environment for rats, and you have higher concentration of people. And if you think about our current experience of the coronavirus, there is a bit of analogy you can draw there. New York City is getting hammered. And part of that may have been because they didn't get their measures in quickly enough to separate people, but it's also because you're in New York City and you are tightly packed in. Uh, People have to use the subway to get around. Most people don't have cars unless you're going to walk or take a cab, and that gets a little limited when everybody's trying to take a cab or an Uber even or a Lyft. Then you end up in the subways where you're tightly crammed into little cars. You still see pictures of it every day when people are going to work. They're all wearing their face masks and they're trying to distance as much as you can. But for anybody who's been in the New York subway system, as I have many times during rush hour, you're going to be jammed in like a damn sardine. That's why you need to keep people at home so that they can have a lessening experience of that, because that will spread the disease. In the case of the Black Death, if you're in a tighter population and a less sanitized population, it means you have greater opportunity to transfer the fleas. Or if you're talking about pneumonic, it's possible for you to cough on somebody more effectively and spread it. And so these tight populations, if you're in an urban center, you suffer more from it. And there's also a possible indirect connection between malnutrition and death rates, because the malnourished tend to be packed into more population dense parts of cities. And it wouldn't necessarily be the malnutrition that's killing them, it's the fact that because they're poorer, they're packed in tighter in more tenement type arrangements. And this is why mortality rates would have been higher there for them within that segment, even of the urban environment. It would be worse in the more packed in parts than in the less packed in parts. The plague at certain points appeared to be more severe among the young. Uh, and this would slow demographic recovery, because if the young are being taken out of the population more than the more elderly, it means that you have less of a chance to recover the population generationally. And it's why the plague might have been a special break on population growth after the initial hammer drops in the mid 14th century. The plague of 1361-62, which was the first great recurrence of it in most places, was called the children's plague because contemporary observers had the sense that it was affecting the young disproportionately, unlike the coronavirus, which tends to attack elderly populations, although it attacks everybody. And I don't want you to have any illusions about that. The mortality rates are higher among the elderly. They're more susceptible to it because of age and a greater tendency to have certain underlying conditions, which would make them more vulnerable. But it's affecting people in every age cohort. Not as many in some, but everybody. And there have been people who have died in every age cohort. And so you're all young, hale, and hearty people. But I do want to give you this one warning about the coronavirus. Well, it's a bifurcated warning. First warning is, yes, you can catch this. You have a better chance of it not hurting you as much, but you could die from this. And so for in terms of your own personal equation, I don't like to be that gloomy or make statements that sound that threatening, but be careful. And you don't want to give it to other people who are more vulnerable. And that's just a part about being a good person and considering yourself part of a larger community. And so think about it on both ends. Do you want to give this to your nana or your grandfather? No, you don't. And so, follow the rules. Do the things that you're being asked to do, and we'll all get through this so much better. Sounds hard now, but when you think about it, to sit at home and for me to read any book I want to read and watch any DVD and listen to any CD like Steve Earle that I want to listen to, there are worse ways to spend your time, kids. So try to be nice to each other and do what's being asked of you here. There are generations who've been asked to do so much more in very dire circumstances than what we're being asked to do here now. Now, anyway, okay, you have this recurring demographic crisis, and what it meant is that in England you have a downward trend in population that continued until really the middle of the 15th century at earliest. So you have a demographic trough for about a century and maybe a bit beyond that, where it's only beginning to climb out by that point. What was the cumulative result? Well, it was a far less populous England, a far less populous Europe. Population in many parts of Western Europe continued to decline during the second half of the 14th century and for most of the 15th century, as in England. This decline in population distorted all the economic and social relationships that had characterized the High Middle Ages. And this is part of the reason why during the late medieval period you see these medieval institutions begin to fracture and fall apart in very significant ways. And that's how you begin to break things that allow you to get into something like early modernity. This certainly would speed all of those processes. And when you think about the economy in 1500 as it emerges from this period, it was profoundly different than it had been in 1300. You're still in the Middle Ages in 1300. By the 1500, you're entering early modernity in terms of economic arrangements. And there are other things that are going to occur, but these demographic shifts had a lot to do with that. Which leaves us one final topic that I sort of appended to the end of this. We'll talk a little bit at the very end about popular rebellion in England. Because one of the things that begins to occur in the late Middle Ages is that you have a more restive peasantry. A little bit of turbulence begins to enter the picture for a variety of reasons. You eventually have in 1381 a major general peasants' rebellion in England, a very famous one, the Great Peasants' Rebellion of 1381. And the question is, what causes this? Now, bear in mind chronology. Great Famine, 1315 through 22. Black Death, in England, 1349-50 mostly. And then 3 decades further in the future, you have this gigantic peasant rebellion. So in terms of chronology in a linear sense, boom, boom, boom. 3 big events, 3 big broad events occurring in the same century. And there have been some smaller rebellions prior to this, more localized, but we don't have the time or space to get into them here. What causes these rebellions? Well, a lot of speculation about this. There are various ways of looking at it. The most obvious thing that most people would probably gravitate toward is this notion of oppression. I'm going to take a sip here. Another parenthetical note. I don't know if you're familiar with this. This is an ale 8, and I will tell you that it's a non-alcoholic beverage, although it looks like it's in a beer bottle. The only reason I mention this, another digression in the popular culture. This is something that when I was in college in Lexington, Kentucky, you could only find within a 75-mile radius of a town called Winchester, just outside of Lexington. So it's a local thing. I would drink it in college because although it's sort of like ginger ale, it's kind of fruity and gingery, citrusy. This thing is loaded to the gills with caffeine. And so when I was in college and I needed to stay up late at night to get a project done, say maybe pull the rare all-nighter, which I, for the most part, tried to avoid in college, I would get a 6-pack of this stuff and I would be vibrating for the entire evening. The reason why I mentioned from a popular culture perspective, there was a TV show on a number of years ago, I think it was on FX, called Justified, which is set in eastern Kentucky. It's sort of like a Western. It's about a federal marshal who gets sent back. He'd gone to Florida working for the Marshal Service, gets into some trouble, and his punishment is to go back to Kentucky, where he's originally from. He's from eastern Kentucky. And so he works out of the Federal Marshal's office in Lexington, the town where I went to college. That's where UK is. And it's a wonderful series. Really loved it. Did 6 seasons of it. The main character is a guy named Raylan Givens, who's played by a wonderful actor, Timothy Oliphant, who also appeared in Deadwood. He's just a great actor. And he owns that character. He's wonderful in it. And the reason why I mentioned the ale 8 is that in one of the episodes, since this is set in eastern Kentucky, actually, one of the episodes, Raylan Givens is caught in a little bit of a firefight, a gun battle. He's pinned down behind a row of vehicles, and he and the people he's pinned down with are trying to figure out a way to get out, to create a diversion and break down the gunfight. And they decide they need to go to unconventional methods, and they're going to make a Molotov cocktail. So they start digging around in one of the vehicles to find a bottle, and the only thing they could find was an ale 8 bottle, which means nothing to anybody who's not from Kentucky and from that part of Kentucky, although I think they distribute it a little bit more widely now. So I will say, when that happened in that episode, I stood up out of my chair. I was sitting here in the basement, and I stand up and applauded and practically cheered because it meant they had a continuity person on that show that understood a little something about Kentucky. So there's an ale 8. If you get a chance, I think they sell it in the 4-packs here in town now. You can actually don't have to go to Kentucky to get it, although I brought this from Kentucky the last time I was there. I always get a couple 6-packs of it. Have an ale 8. So I'm sure you did not give a rat's ass about that, but since that's what I'm Beveraging with, I thought I would mention it. And I strongly recommend Justify as a TV series. It's a great TV series. Um, anyway, oppression. You might assume that the peasants rebel because, as in the case with Albert Finney and Network, they got mad as hell and they couldn't take it anymore. Uh, so sort of a pressure cooker theory that the peasants were so oppressed that it was a pressure cooker that eventually exploded into hyperviolence. This seems unlikely, actually, because if we study the effects of the demographic shifts in more detail, what you discover is that after the Black Death, the lot of many peasants actually improved. Uh, there were labor shortages. Because so many people had died, it meant that labor became a scarcer commodity and that they could demand increased wages and reduction of services. And you see this occurring in the decades subsequent to the Black Death. So they're probably a little less oppressed in the wake of the Black Death as they're moving into this period. And we should note that rebellions didn't tend to occur during periods of most acute stress. I mean, if you think about the Great Famine, that's a period where the stress is on everybody. Do the peasants suddenly revolt against their lords during that period? Actually, they don't. You know, things get very chaotic, but they generally stay within that system. And you don't see peasant rebellion during the Black Death. People had other things that they were concerned with. It's a time of great stress, but no general rebellions. They occur later as conditions are beginning to slightly improve. So this has led people to suggest that maybe the principal reason for this was rising expectations, that society is beginning to change, that modern improvements led to a desire for quicker process, for improvements to come more rapidly and to be a bit larger in scope, greater in depth. And that's a possibility, that people became impatient because once they saw that society could change, they wanted the change to come a little more rapidly. And it is clear that during the late medieval period, you're beginning to see changes in the conception of social order. If you recall, when we were talking about town and country, about the peasantry, we had mentioned this notion of a tripartite social order. Those who worked, those who prayed, those who fought. This notion that things were divinely sanctioned, that God placed you in the place you were in, and the expectation generally was you would stay in that place because that's how God had ordained it. And there were, it's an idealized conception, but there was also, of course, a sense that quite a few people bought into that you didn't see much of a sense of social revolution during the high medieval period. There was not much notion of a notion of social advancement, that a peasant did not become a noble. Now, a peasant might get into the church and advance in that way, but even there, for most of them, there was kind of a glass ceiling. It's the people from a more noble background who advanced more broadly and rapidly. It was rare for peasants to get really high up. I think the one counterexample I gave of you of that is Robert Grosseteste, who became Bishop of Lincoln and became a great theologian who was a peasant. But he is, I wouldn't say he's the exception who proves the rule, because if you have exceptions, you don't have a rule, but he is unusual in that rarely occurred to that extent where you'd have that degree of social mobility. The one place where you would see where that would be different would be in the towns, once the towns appear, where it would be possible for somebody to come in of very low status and become important. And we gave you that example. That's a guy named Simon Paris, who fled his village, ends up in London, and ends up being a sheriff at that point. He went way up in the social hierarchy. So that was the one exception. But when you think about this period, there's very little conception in the high Middle Ages of social advancement. That most change was so gradual as to be almost imperceptible. That you didn't see change, therefore you didn't assume there was change, because things are pretty much the same in terms of the social constructs year in and year out. It's the same thing over and over and over again ad infinitum. And so you have this notion of the static order. And peasants, in a way, are very little C conservative. What do I mean by that? Well, they're unwilling to make fundamental changes to a system that ensures survival. The sense is that even if survival's at a very low level, if you start monkeying with the system, you might actually change something that would make your survival very dicey. You didn't want to play with it. It's letting you get by most years. And if you think that the system is static And if you start monkeying with that system, you might change something in the wrong direction. You do have this little C conservatism. I saw a little bit of this with my grandfather. I mean, to give you the perfect example, he was a tobacco farmer. And this was a guy, and I don't know how much you know about tobacco cultivation. I have a lot of tobacco tools in the basement as sort of a cultural heritage because I got to work with it to some degree involuntarily as a child. I lived with my grandfather for a period, my mother and my brother and I. And He actually did not like mechanization. He set all of his tobacco with a hand setter, not with a tractor-driven mechanical setter. So it took him a while to do it, but he put each plant in with loving care, and if one didn't make it, he would go out and replace it with loving care. He did not own a tractor. He pulled his tobacco wagon in when they were harvesting by an unmatched horse and mule team on a wagon. He kept a horse and a mule that he would use. He'd hook them up and off they'd go. And that's the way he did it. The only time that he deviated from that was one year when it was rainy, too much rain this spring, where he couldn't set it by hand. And he relented and allowed us, and I was a teenager when this occurred, to have a tractor brought in with a mechanical setter that you ride on the back of it. You do it very quickly, very efficiently, almost perfectly. And he refused to do it himself. He stood on the side of the field and he accepted the fact that we were doing it and more or less shaking his head no, thinking, no, this is nowhere nearly as good. And I will say something from my grandfather. Anecdotally, I've heard this again and again and again, that he would take this lovingly tended tobacco crop to market every year, and every time he would do it, he would get the top price at the market that day because he devoted that kind of labor and attention to his cancer stick production. For whatever that's worth. So there is this little C conservatism you sometimes see among farmers, and these peasants during the Middle Ages were like that. My grandfather, I think in his own mind, felt that the second that he starts monkeying with the system he's put together, he's not going to top out the market at that point. There's going to be something fundamentally wrong with it. And I would love to know, and I didn't think to ask at the time, what happened that year that it was done mechanically, whether it made any difference or not. Maybe he was right. Who knows? But you do have this. And explains why peasant communities can be very resistant to the idea of change, even if it would be positive change, because they're so wedded to what the system is giving them, and they don't want to do anything to destroy that, to put it in jeopardy. Now, what does happen, however, is that during the late Middle Ages, they see this demographic crisis, things like the Great Famine and the Black Death, and they see people dying. And peasants and nobles and townsmen, everybody. Nobody's getting particularly special treatment in this. And they begin to maybe question the assumptions about society because they begin to see changes occur right in the wake of each of these large events. And so once they begin to question, and once change begins to occur and they see improvement, there are lots of reasons for them to become impatient and press for more and more quickly, which leads us to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. After the Black Death, there were almost immediately demands for higher wages and services by peasants. And in towns too, people would try to demand higher wages. The government tried to push back against this. You have, first of all, in 1349, a thing called the Ordinance of Laborers, which I didn't stick on your transparency. It's sort of a precursor to the more important enactment. This thing in 1352 called the Statute of Laborers. This was an effort, this was issued by the king through Parliament, it's a statute. It was an effort to freeze wages and social mobility. Basically, what it called for is wages to return to the level of 1346, 3 years before the plague. So they want to move wages backward in time because people are demanding higher wages and higher payments. And anyone who was convicted of accepting wages higher than that level were to pay twice the wages received as a fine. So there's going to be a punishment for it. And anyone who paid these higher wages would also be penalized. So it tried to enforce against anybody who might demand wages and anybody who might pay them because labor was short, basically. And there was a desire to keep people from actually competing with each other for workers. They wanted to try to basically nail everybody to the ground again as much as they could. It was not something you could easily enforce. but it was heavily resented because they did try to enforce the statute of laborers. And the Crown continued to send commissioners out to enforce it over time. We have a lot of records of this stuff, actually. You can read all about it from a bureaucratic official perspective if that's something that floats your boat. What made matters worse is that the French were also raiding along the southern portion of England, and this increased the sense of insecurity in many villages, a sense that the nobility, these people were supposed to be fighting, that was supposed to be their function, they weren't properly protecting people. And so you have this pushback on wages, you have these coastal raids that are occurring, and also what you always have is individual memories of aristocratic violence, where your lord at some point might have done something kind of mean to you. I will say that, we don't know, it's hard to get at what individual peasants experienced because they don't write about it. You see it through another filter. And it's hard in a lot of cases to get at the behavior of individual lords. I think, if any of these lords were more enlightened, they probably realize that you don't get far by brutalizing your peasants because you need them to work, basically, that a little good treatment might go a long way. But you always find these people are perfectly happy to basically beat the crap, wail anybody who's beneath them on the social scale when they get frustrated. And so very frequently you have peasants who have a very specific sense of personal grievance against their lord for some act that the lord committed to against them at some point or another. And you never want to actually discount the strength of these feelings. There's one person we're going to talk about in reference to this peasant rebellion, a guy named Wat Tyler, who was one of the ringleaders. It's clear he despised his lord, that he felt that his lord had mistreated him a lot of times over his career as a peasant in a village. And if he was going to get a chance to get back at this guy, he was going to take it, basically. And so there's a certain element of that as well in cases of individual senses of grievance against a lord. What sets it off? Well, a lot of people associate this with this thing called the poll taxes, which were levied. Particularly the ones levied in 1380 and 1381. What was a poll tax? A poll tax was a regressive tax. It was a tax that was levied at a few pennies or whatever it was in each individual one on everybody in England who was an adult, male or female, at the same rate, which meant that if you were a noble, you paid the same amount that Joe Peasant paid. And so that it meant if you were, a prosperous businessman, it wasn't even a burden at all. If you were a noble, it was almost meaningless. If you were a peasant, it could be pretty steep. Coughing up these few pennies or whatever it was for the poll tax assessment. So it was a regressive tax. And actually, in the late 80s, you had something in England called the poll tax rebellion. Believe it or not, it was under the late years of Margaret Thatcher when she was prime minister. The reason why they call it this because it is a direct reference back to these poll taxes of the 14th century. They instituted something in England called the council tax, which in the minds of most people was a totally regressive tax, as it was imposed. And so you had huge protests, demonstrations, and some degree of violence out in the street in England protesting against these particular council taxes that were imposed in the late 80s. They called them the poll tax, and they called themselves poll tax rebels. And so sometimes these historical references work very well across a number of centuries. In terms of the 1380 tax, it was fairly moderate, and it was somewhat successful to the extent that people didn't rebel against it particularly. They paid it, and the crown got its money. The 1381 one was problematic. It was heavier, it was poorly assessed, and there was widespread evasion of it because it's two taxes in consecutive years. When you look at the poll tax returns, and we have these, you can look at them, most of them, there was an apparent decrease in population. In other words, people were evading it, so it looks like the country had suddenly lost a big chunk of its population. This led the royal government to send commissioners out again to try to enforce it, and this was roundly hated. Some of these commissioners were physically assaulted, some were even killed. by people. They were oh so upset that the commissioners were out trying to enforce the poll tax. Uh, there were rumors circulating that commissioners examined girls to see if they were virgins, and if they were not, they charged them the poll tax as adults regardless of their age. Whether this happened or not, we don't know, but it's these sorts of rumors that begin to circulate that create anger, that basically maximize resentment. Making it a little dicier during the time, you begin to hear this strain of apocalyptic preaching, where you have people sort of from the pulpit and sometimes not, preaching in a very specific way. Most famous of them, one of the ringleaders of the rebellion, was this man named John Ball. He was a former clergyman. He'd been defrocked for various reasons. And this is what is recorded about one of his sermons. He says this: "Oh, good people, things do not go well in England, and they will not go well until everything is held in common and there are no more serfs or lords." Oh my goodness, does this man sound like a social revolutionary? My Steve Earle Minor really sounds like a communist practically. Jeez. What is he saying? Why should we be kept thus in bondage? We are all come from one father and mother, Adam and Eve. Getting a little biblical here. How can they say or prove that they are greater lords than we are, except that they make us work for what they spend? So this is apocalyptic. It's a message of social revolution. And this was the sort of thing that people like John Ball, who apparently was very charismatic in his preaching, was suggesting publicly, and it was rousing people. That people were really upset, and this added to the mix. It magnified this sense of grievance that people were harboring. He's calling for the elimination of social distinctions. That let's get rid of the notions of serfdom and nobility, because we're all the same people. We are all ultimately from the same father and mother, and by what right do they make us work for them and take everything that we work for? And so you begin to see these messages percolating, and the message resonates with people. He also preached that the end was imminent, that we're heading for the apocalypse and we should straighten this stuff up out now. This sort of sinful, terrible situation he sees. And then you ask yourself, how does this fit with the notion of a static social order? What they're arguing is the social order is not static. They seem to be arguing that the social order actually has been perverted in some fundamental way, and it's time to redress that, to put things back to what they should be, where everybody's the same, that everybody should hold everything in common. So what he's arguing for is a type of biblically sanctioned communism. And we should note that this is a very attractive idea among many Christians in the Middle Ages, and particularly people who rebel, because when you think about it in terms of Christ's message and the way he interacted with his disciples, he instructed them not to worry, that God would provide, and they shared everything, that there was a type of Christian communism within these communities, communism within a little c. And so for many people, as they hear Christian message, this really does appeal to them. It strikes a chord in an absolute sense with many people. It particularly appealed to many potential leaders of the revolt, people who are willing to present themselves as somebody to lead. And this is where you have someone like Wat Tyler appearing on the scene. The revolt was primarily in the south of England, although you see some pockets of it further northward. I would show you a map, but you know South and North England at this point. You don't need that. In terms of the major outbreak, most people suggest that the first violence occurs in Fobbing in the county of Essex, not too far from London, north of London, where there was an attack on the local poll tax commissioner on the 31st of May in 1381. So this is sort of the thin end of the wedge. It then spreads to Kent further south. And in terms of the numbers of people involved, it's hard to get at precisely, but the number you always see is that there were about 100,000 or so peasants who become involved in this peasants' revolt. It was the largest of the medieval popular revolts. There are bigger ones in early modernity, but this is the biggest one during the Middle Ages. And so it's a very large major revolt. And so at this juncture, we talk about Wat Tyler, this fellow who resented his lord. He aroused the peasantry in Kent. And some statements are attributed to him. He apparently was saying in public, "We come not as thieves or robbers. We come seeking social justice." Oh my goodness. Wat Tyler is a social justice warrior. something to consider there. He leads an attack on Rochester Castle, and then he takes Canterbury, and then he leads the crowds who are following him onto London. Once they arrive in London, the poor open the city gates to the rebels, and there's a reign of terror for several days. It gets exceedingly ugly and violent in the city of London as these people pour in. Apparently, Wat Tyler does eventually find his lord, and he settles the score with him in a very hyper-violent way. So, what happens? How does the nobility and the monarchy respond to this? The king at the time is Richard II. And actually, one of you is writing on Richard II, which is way cool. His reign began in 1377, so he's early in, and he's effectively just a boy. He's very, very young at this juncture. But he eventually does have a conference with the leaders of the rebellion, and actually most of these rebels, they're convinced that if they could just talk to the king, they could plead their case, and he would see that they're right and would support them. And at this meeting, he promises the abolition of unfree tenure. They're going to eliminate serfdom. That he's going to fix the rents per acre of land so they don't have to pay exorbitant rents. And that he promises some other privileges. The clerks, after the meeting, they spend the night producing documents. There's a conference the next day, and various stories about it. The principal thing that seems to come out of it is that Wat Tyler, it's felt, had behaved in kind of a disrespectful way. They claim he kind of thumbed his nose or blew his nose in a funny way at some point that was deemed disrespectful. And one of the nobles around Richard can't control himself. He just couldn't resist killing Wat Tyler and kills him on the spot. And this seems to be sort of a watershed in the rebellion, that the upper classes then strike back against these peasant rebels and the rebellion's put down. John Ball is captured and executed, and his head, along with those of others, are displayed on London Bridge as a warning. And so they begin the process of putting the rebellion down, which takes some time. But that killing of Wat Tyler seems to be sort of the juncture at which things begin to go a little south for the peasantry. In addition to this main rebellion, there were local uprisings in Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk to the north of London. One I'm familiar with is since Bury St. Edmunds seems to come up a lot. There was a rebellion actually centered on Bury St. Edmunds. In this instance, it was a separate peasant leader. It was this guy named Jack Raw, W-R-A-W-E. He begins to assemble some rebels, and he seizes the local commissioner of the poll tax. One of these guys had been sent out to enforce it. He then goes to Bury St. Edmunds. He starts out in the countryside, goes into the city. When he gets into the town with his band of rebels, he discovers that the abbot's out of town, as he frequently is. Would this surprise you, having read Jocelyn Brakeman's Chronicle? This continues, this notion of the abbot not being around most of the time. I think he was actually down in London at this juncture. So they seize the second of command, the prior, the number 2 official in the monastery, and they basically decapitate both the prior and the commissioner of the poll tax. They place their heads on pikes. They do a procession through the town of Bury, the rebels do. Then they go to the pillory where you would, hang people and place people in stocks in some cases. They put the 2 heads on top of the pillories, and I got to tell you, where I first read about this, I was reading things very specific about Bury St. Edmunds, and one of the chroniclers of the 14th century that deals with Bury a little bit is a guy named Thomas of Walsingham. At the time that I was doing this work, this had not been translated yet into English. You only had the Latin version. So I get to this juncture, I'm going through the parts and reading the bits that I need to read to understand what's going on, and I get to this description of it, and I'm dealing with the Latin, and I can't hardly believe what I'm reading. So I go back through a couple or 3 times to check to make certain I'm understanding this correctly, that I'm not mistranslating something. What they did is they sort of played Punch and Judy with these 2 guys' heads. They would turn one head to make it look like he's whispering in the ear of the other. Then they would turn that head back to the front again and turn the other guy's head. And they thought this was incredibly funny, apparently. And the idea is that they had been conspiring, that the churchman conspires with the royal representative to shake money out of you, and you can't trust either one of them, seemed to be the message that they were trying to convey in it. And so you have this weird thing going on, this sort of Punch and Judy thing with their heads after they'd been decapitated. As with all these rebellions, you see a sifting of the sponge in the nobility, and it's eventually put down pretty violently. All of the local rebellions are eventually quashed, as was the main one in London, which leads us to the consequences. Were they successful? Well, in terms of practical success, little or nothing was accomplished by them. At best, promises were made, which were then broken once order was restored. At worst, you have brutal suppression of the participants and execution of the ringleaders. And so, in the short term, not a lot. What led to change more effectively was the process of economic and demographic change. That the changes made by the mortality of the Black Death and the Great Famine, those were the agents of change in the long term that made most of the difference. And what do the rebellions say about late medieval society? Well, we should note that there have been times during the High Middle Ages, in the earlier period, where you would have social tensions, but general rebellions were virtually unknown during the High Medieval period. Nothing like this. This is a late medieval phenomenon, by and large. The tensions, there was tensions between the bourgeoisie and the other social classes because they were the new Johnnies on the block. But even those didn't lead to general rebellions. You would sometimes have urban rebellions to get rights, but these were within a particular town at a particular time, and once they were over, they were over. And they often didn't get this violent, as you would have with the Peasants' Rebellion. Perhaps the best explanation you can be given for what's going on between the High and Late Middle Ages is that during the High Middle Ages, the economy was expanding, that essentially you were having growth in the most general sense. And in an expanding society, maybe it's a little easier to absorb the social tensions. And indeed, you have virtually no conception of rebellion during the High Medieval period. It's just not something people even thought about much. You have this notion of static order, you have an expanding economy, and so maybe that's what kept a lid on things for the most part. And people across the social spectrum, by and large, accepted social order and the stratum to which they had been assigned by birth. But when you have a contracting society where you have all these stresses and then a sudden release of the stresses during the late medieval period, uh, maybe it wouldn't absorb this that well. That, once growth stops, once you begin to get into these stresses, things begin to be pent up. Some of that's probably going to come out. And once you do have this release and people can see things can change and people can see progress, you're playing a slightly different ball game at that point. What is clear is that this is further evidence, these rebellions, of the fraying of medieval society. What had worked during the High Middle Ages was not working during the Late Middle Ages in any number of ways. We've dealt with that a little bit with the Black Death. We're going to deal with it also in this notion of the next topic, the 100 Years' War. In an ideal world, we would have talked about the church more, but obviously there were problems there as well, and so you have these interlocking crises that occur. We're going to now move on to the political and military one and assess what role it played into these changes as the Middle Ages are fraying out into something that will become early modernity that you would take in different courses, your Ren and Ref courses. Having said that, we've rattled on for a couple of hours, which is more than enough, and we've digressed a couple of times about various things, so we'll call it quits here for the day, and then we'll pick up with our final topic on the syllabus in the next lecture. And so everybody be well, be safe, and we will be in touch with you later. Bye-bye.